Philippians 2, Jesus is not God. Philippians 2, verse 5 to 11 is one of the most commonly cited proof texts for the deity and incarnation of Christ. But what does this text actually say? Is Jesus really God? In this video, we're going to look at a common proof text used by Trinitarians for the deity and incarnation of Christ. We're going to go through the passage in detail. We'll explore the way that Trinitarians read this passage, and we'll also think about what Paul might actually be saying. Let's start by reading the passage itself, so we know what we're talking about. This short passage comes in the context of Paul's exhortation to the church at Philippi to be humble, following Christ's example. First, let's read the passage according to the New Living Translation. It says, "You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, he did not think equality with God was something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on the cross. Therefore, God elevated him to the place of highest honor and gave him the name above all other names, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue declare that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." You can see why someone reading this passage would think that the passage supports the doctrine of the Trinity. It says that Jesus was God, and that he gave up divine privileges, that he was born human. It seems like he was describing the incarnation, the idea that Jesus was God, but born as a human. But it's not that simple. All translation involves an element of interpretation. And I think in this case, the interpretation is misleading. As we'll see, different translations of this passage vary considerably, and we might think that some have been a bit more creative than others. So let's go through the passage line by line and think about what it might be saying. Let's start with that first line. The New Living Translation said, "Though he was God." The New International Version says, "being in very nature God." However, more literal translations, like the English Standard Version, say, "though he was in the form of God." And this is closest to the Greek text, which would literally be rendered "in the form of God," or just possibly being in the form of a God. Had Paul meant to say that Jesus was God, or was a God, he would have had a very simple way of doing so. That's not a difficult thing to say in Greek. So the fact that he doesn't use those words makes it very unlikely that that's what he means. Also, had Paul meant to be talking about Jesus' nature, saying that Jesus had the nature of God, again, he would have used other words. Look at this passage from Galatians chapter 4, where Paul talks about the nature of gods, or perhaps more correctly, the false gods who did not actually have divine nature. He uses the Greek word physis for nature. And again, when you look at that verse from 2 Peter chapter 1, it talks about participating in the divine nature. And again, the Greek word used is physis. So had Paul wanted to say that Jesus had divine nature, there are other words he could have used to say that. Instead, what Paul says is that Jesus was in the form of God. The word he uses is morphe, which is most commonly used in reference to outward appearance rather than essence or being. For example, at the end of Mark's gospel, it describes how the resurrected Jesus appeared to two disciples in a different form. This is, of course, the parallel account to the appearance on the road to Emmaus that you find in Luke's gospel. Now, when Mark talks about appearing in a different form, he's not talking about a change of nature. He uses that same word, morphe. But it isn't a metaphysical change that he's talking about, not a change in essence, but a change in appearance. The same word morphe is used later in the verse where Paul is talking about Jesus taking the form of a servant, or perhaps the form of a slave. The word doulos primarily did refer to slaves, but we do see examples of that word being used of paid service. So either translation may be permissible depending on context. Now, being a servant or being a slave is not an issue of nature or essence. It's a matter of your role or station in life. It is something exterior to you. Given that Jesus was never actually a slave, he was never owned by anyone, nor was he ever a paid servant, as far as the Gospels say, Paul's choice of words here seem to be very careful. Jesus took on the form of a servant, the form of a slave. And of course, we see many examples of Jesus performing acts of service, perhaps most memorably the washing of his disciples' feet, as recorded in John's Gospel. So all in all, it's very unlikely that Paul thought of morphe as referring to divine nature, but meant that Jesus resembled God in some other way. Let's look at that second part of the verse. The New Living Translation had, he did not think equality with God as something to cling to. But again, we see a range of translations. One of the reasons for this range of translations stems from the theological debate as to whether Jesus gave up divine nature or not. That is not something that every Trinitarian is willing to say. If Jesus did not cling to equality with God, then that means that he had to give up equality with God. And not every Trinitarian will agree with that. The classic formulation of the incarnation, as expressed in the hypostatic union, says that Jesus was both fully God and fully human at the same time. So some Trinitarians will be really uncomfortable with the idea that Jesus gave up divine nature to become human. Now, literal translations like the English Standard Version are closest to the Greek. The word translated equality here is the Greek word isos and can be used of things that are alike in quantity or in quality. It's too general a word to read much into. However, the word translated a thing to be grasped, harpagamos, is used only once in the whole Bible. So translators have to look to the way that word is used in other contemporary Greek texts to determine its meaning. You can grasp at something to seize it, hence some translations use the word robbery, but you can also grasp on something to retain it, to hold on to something that you already have. So Paul might be talking about seizing equality with God, or he might be talking about holding on to equality with God. Think about which of those possibilities makes most sense to you. Maybe let us know in the comments below. Some scholars have seen the potential parallel between the story of Adam and Eve. Genesis chapter 1 says that men and women were created in the image of God. And then in chapter 3, we find the serpent tempting Eve, saying that she will be like God. Paul may be contrasting the behavior of Adam and Eve with the behavior of Jesus. Both were made in the image of God, but Jesus rejected that temptation to be like God and so receives a great blessing instead of a curse. We know from elsewhere in Paul's writings that the parallelism between Adam and Jesus was important for him. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he describes Jesus as the last Adam. So it would not be surprising if Paul was making the same parallel here. At very least, thinking about the story of Adam and Eve demonstrates there are a number of ways in which a human might be like God. In that story, being like God meant knowing good and evil. I think the scholarly consensus now tends towards the idea that harpagamos is used in the sense of retaining something. So the translation might be something along the lines of that Jesus did not consider being like God something to retain. Paul has already said that Jesus was in the form of God, that he resembled God in some sense. So clearly he thinks that Jesus is like God, and this second line affirms that same idea. But Jesus chose not to retain that likeness. Paul expands on that in the next line. Again, we see a range of translations. The word Paul uses, keno, for giving up, literally means something like to make empty or to make void. Some people have read this as referring to giving up divine nature, the idea that Christ emptied himself of his divine nature and so he could become human. This is known as kenosis theory. It's a reaction to traditional Trinitarian thinking, where Christ had both natures simultaneously, being both fully God and fully human at the same time. Now, this video isn't about metaphysics or philosophy, but I must confess I see profound difficulties with the idea that somebody could be both fully human and fully God at the same time. One might say it sounds like a contradiction. However, the idea that somebody who was fully God could somehow empty himself of that divine nature also seems fraught with difficulties. So I'm not really sure how much kenosis theory really solves. But in any case, it rests on the assumption that Paul is talking about nature, and we've already seen that that's unlikely. We've seen that Paul talks about form rather than nature. Given that this whole passage is about humility, it seems to make sense that a translation about Christ giving up status or reputation would seem more appropriate, especially since the consequence of Jesus making himself nothing was to become a servant or a slave. Once again, with the next line, we see a range of translations, some of which refer to birth, the birth of Jesus. The word Paul uses here is gignomai, which can be used in the context of human birth, but it's certainly not the common word for being born. It simply is the word for becoming and can refer to any number of changes, including changes of status and location. Given that in the sequence of the passage, Jesus has already taken the form of a servant, it's unlikely that Paul is now going to go back and talk about his birth. It would be actually problematic for the Trinitarian if Paul was talking about birth, because Paul does not say that Jesus became a human being, but says that he came in human likeness. Again, Paul isn't talking about nature, he's talking about appearance. But that is problematic if Paul is talking about Jesus' birth. Trinitarians affirm that Jesus was born fully human, something that I agree with. Trinitarians certainly don't want to say that Jesus was only born in human likeness, as though he wasn't actually human. I think we all agree that Jesus was genuinely human. So what does Paul mean then? Well, since he's already said that Jesus took the form of a servant, this subsequent statement is about the appearance that Jesus adopted. In contrast to being in the form of God, he is now the image or appearance of any other person. This is reinforced by this next line, where Jesus is found in human appearance. It's unlikely this means that Jesus found himself to be in the form of a human. This word can be used in a range of contexts, including legal proceedings, how a judge finds someone. This is about how others perceived him. They judged him to be in appearance as a man. The word Paul uses here for appearance is schema. It's about one's external condition, the figure and manner of one's life. Paul is saying that when others looked at Jesus, his appearance, his manner of life, they concluded that he was just like any other human. They didn't see his true status, his true authority. Otherwise, they couldn't have put him to death. It's worth noting that throughout this passage, again and again, Paul uses that language of appearance, the form of God, the form of a servant, human likeness, human appearance. Nothing to do with a change of nature, nothing to do with metaphysics, and everything to do with a change in appearance, a change of status, a change in reputation. The conclusion of this passage is instructive. God rewards Christ because of his humility, exalting him and giving him the name above every name. Note that Christ did not just automatically return to heaven, which surely would have been his right if he was fully God. No, it is God who exalts him. And again, note that he is given the name that is above every name. Now, surely the highest name is the name of God. So if Christ were fully God from all eternity, then he would have already had the name above every name. But no, that is something given to him by God as a reward for his humility. And again, note that every tongue confesses that Jesus is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Jesus is not co-equal with the Father in status or honor. All things are done to the glory of God. And this includes what Jesus does himself. This is not what you would say about somebody who was fully God from all eternity. This is what you say about somebody who was obedient to God and was rewarded by him with new status, authority, and honor. So despite the appearances given by some misleading translations, this passage does not say that Jesus is God, or that he had divine nature, or that he was incarnated, or anything of the sort. So what is this passage about? This passage is about humility. Paul is giving us an example to follow of somebody who had certain privileges and status, but instead of pursuing those privileges to his own advantage, chose to put the interests of others first. And so Paul contrasts the privileges Jesus had, being in the image of God, with the humble status he adopts, being in the image of a slave. For example, in the Gospels, Jesus said that he could summon 12 legions of angels to his defense if he wanted to, but Jesus never once uses that power. Jesus clearly had special power and authority, a power and authority that could only come from God, and yet he never uses that power to his own advantage. Instead, throughout his life, he took a humble road and appeared to many to be just like any other man. Pilate says as much when he presents Jesus to the baying crowd. Behold the man. And so, being judged to be just like any other man, he is put to death. But Paul also wants to tell us that God rewards such humility. Again and again, he appeals to Christ as an example, because after his death on the cross, Jesus was brought back to life and exalted to God's right hand. This new status, power, and authority is given as a reward for his humility during his life on earth. The message for us is to follow Christ's example, that regardless of our own situation in life, our status, our power, our authority, we too should put others first, even if it is to our own disadvantage. And God, who sees the hearts of men, will reward us for such humility. So actually, this passage doesn't say that Jesus is God. Actually, Paul says that Jesus was in the form of God. And when you think about it, that really implies the opposite, that he was not God. What this passage does do is encourage us all to be humble and to put others first. And I hope that's a message that we can all take to heart. But what do you think? Does this passage say that Jesus is God, or that he was in the form of God? And why do some translations say that Jesus was God if the original Greek said something different? Let us know your thoughts below. If you found this video useful, click the like button, and why not share it with a friend? And if you're interested in knowing more about this topic, there are plenty more videos on this channel for you to explore.